Just a good morning to everyone as people are filing in. We're excited to have you. We'll begin in just a minute or two. All right, I've been given the high sign that we can begin. First of all, welcome. I'm thrilled to have so many of you with us today for this important topic. On behalf of myself and Earl Lewis, want to welcome you to the fourth installment of the Academic Leadership Institute's webinar series. Now, just a quick note and reminder that this webinar is being recorded. So we will be allowing it to be used for later screenings and maybe even during the Academic Leadership Institute in the summer, where we may be using parts of it for instructional purposes as well. We are thrilled to have all of you with us today, and we look forward to this discussion. ALE's mission is to increase the representation of rising leaders committed to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to help colleagues on a path to becoming future presidents and provosts of universities across the different sectors of higher education. And we've already seen many of our Academic Leadership Institute alums go on to be presidents and provosts in the academy, even in the first 2 years of the existence of the Institute. Which of course makes all of us very proud and excited that our alumni are already doing so well. We're looking forward to our third cohort this summer, where we'll all be together for another very exciting year of ALE programming. And this will be, I think, our largest cohort yet. And very excited about that set of leaders coming in. Many of them are with us today. Today's webinar is Strategies for Continuing to Advance Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion while Navigating Provoking Politics and a Post-Affirmative Action World. I am thrilled, really, to welcome a discussion panel featuring a dynamic incredible group of leaders in higher education that's moderated by my friend and colleague, Dr. Robin Means Coleman, also an alum of the program. She is Vice President and Associate Provost for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion and the Chief Diversity Officer at Northwestern University. I want to thank the panelists for participating today and for sharing your insights and your expertise. Now, Robin, I'm going to pass it on to you to formally introduce the panelists and to get us underway today. Over to you.
Thank you, President McBride, and it's always good to see you. Good morning, everyone. Indeed, this is Strategies for Continuing to Advance DEI while Navigating Provoking Politics in a Post-Affirmative Action World. There's been an increasing number of attacks on DEI efforts across the country. Multiple states have introduced bills or taken steps that limit the administrative and pedagogical work of DEI, including a risk to affirmative action in the Supreme Court. This is a panel that considers how we might continue to advance our efforts. It considers what strategies and solutions might be brought to bear as we work through this challenging climate. So, who are we hearing a sort of expert counsel from this morning? I would first like to introduce Dr. Katrice Albert. Dr. Albert currently serves as the Vice President for Institutional Diversity at the University of Kentucky. Prior to that, Dr. Albert served as the Executive Vice President of Inclusion and Human Resources at the NCAA. Previously, Dr. Albert had all the jobs. She served as Vice President for Equity and Diversity of the University of Minnesota System, and before that, as Vice Provost for Equity, Diversity, and Community Outreach at Louisiana State University. She writes, speaks, and consults on the issues of cultural competence and integration, corporate social responsibility, educational and workforce inclusion, gender and dynamics of power, educational access, community university partnership, and more. She has edited 3 volumes, which I encourage you to get your hands on. The first is Reaching the Chair, Transformational Leadership, Lessons and Impactful Success Factors of Intercollegiate Athletics Leaders, which is coming out shortly. The second volume that she has co-edited is Racial Battle Fatigue in Higher Ed, something we know all too well. Racial Battle Fatigue in Higher Education, Exposing the Myth of Post-Racial America. And her third volume, Trayvon Martin, Race and American Justice, Righting Wrong. Welcome, Dr. Alpert. Our second panelist that I would like to welcome is Dr. Peniel Joseph, who is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values, founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or JEDI, at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, Public Policy and International Affairs Program Board Chair, and Distinguished Service Professor and Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. Also a prolific author and editor, including 7 award-winning books, most recently the 3rd Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century. In 2022, most recently, he was named the grand prize winner of the 2022 Hamilton Book Award, the University of Texas's highest research honor for his book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Welcome, Dr. Joseph. And last but certainly not least, my good friend, Dr. Robert Sellers. Dr. Sellers is the Charles D. Moody Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Education at the University of Michigan. Dr. Sellers' primary research activities have focused on the role of race in the psychological lives of African Americans, where he and his students have developed a conceptual and empirical model of African American racial identity. Dr. Sellers has won numerous awards for his scholarship, mentoring, and service. From July 2014 to August 2022, Dr. Sellers served as the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan. As Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Sellers was responsible for the supervision and implementation of the university's first 5-year strategic plan for diversity and inclusion. Panelists, welcome. You can unmute.
Thank you so much, Dr. Means Coleman.
You are welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Audience members, before we get started, I would just like to remind you that our Q&A feature is open throughout our discussion. You can drop questions in there. I will be checking them throughout our conversation. And then at the end, just about 40 minutes before we close, I will absolutely remind you that we are opening up our conversation so that our panelists can engage you. It is a webinar, so we will again be looking for your questions and comments through that Q&A function. But let's get started. Okay, in preparing for this webinar, we really said we didn't want to dig into what me as a horror scholar recall kind of the trauma porn of the work that we do. We wanted to focus on solutions, opportunities for success, and innovation. But DEI is under attack. For example, there are 31 states that are pushing forward these sort of active anti-woke bills. Legislators are demanding an accounting of how much money we spend on DEI initiatives. There are bans on diversity statements and hiring. There's a narrowing of teaching and learning regarding US histories, cultures, identities, and politics. And of course, we're waiting for the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action. It's a lot. So first, How are you doing? And it's never easy to do this work. And if we're not sort of at the nadir of our DEI work, where are you finding your hope, progress, and reward? Dr. Joseph, how are you doing?
I would say that, thank you, Dr. Means Coleman, for the introduction. I'm in Texas, and I would say that Texas and Florida are two of the battleground states among those sort of 31 states that you mentioned. So in a lot of ways, I think it's a really difficult time and terrain, especially considering 3 years ago, in the aftermath of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and so many different promises that were made. So even though I'm an optimist by nature, I'm also a realist, and I do think that we are undergoing nothing less than a redemptionist style backlash against racial justice and racial progress. So I think this period, the scholars who are around us know it and feel it. It's very similar to the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, in a way that I think sometimes, for those who don't take a deeper look at American history, people talk about the 1950s and 1960s, and I understand it, and I see that, I've written about that, but in certain ways, it's much closer. When you see characters like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott, Donald Trump, others, it's much closer to the really, really hardcore racial backlash, white backlash of that period. Now, that being said, I think that what we're seeing is not aberrations, but juxtaposition. So alongside the backlash of the 1860s and 1870s, we saw Black progress. So Fisk University is founded in Tennessee in 1866, the same year that the Klan is founded in Pulaski. So one is going to be founded in Nashville, the other is going to be founded in Pulaski. So two things can operate at the same time. So I think, like President McBride was saying, what Ally is doing, what the works of the panelists and the people who are on this call are doing, we're seeing real headway within higher education. People like yourself, Dr. Means Coleman, Dr. Sellers, so many others who are on this panel who are achieving. We've got the first Black woman president of Harvard University about to be inducted. We've got a Black president at Rice and other places, right? So I think it is a tale of two cities, where even as part of the reason this backlash has so much depth and breadth is because of the progress that was being made, especially in the context of higher education, but also in the context of K through 12 and diversifying that curriculum, right? Yeah.
So I want to get Dr. Albert in on this. And so what Dr. Joseph has set us up for so far is, we know that Texas and Florida is a battleground. We don't want to overlook the unexpected player in this, which is Ohio, kind of a purple state, who has one of the more restrictive sort of anti-woke legislation coming through. But he's also talking about that we're seeing something where we've seen this before. It's a bit cyclical as well. Yes. So again, how are you doing?
Yes.
And where are we finding hope and progress?
Yes. Dr. Means Coleman, thank you so much for moderating us. And President McBride, thank you, and Dr. Lewis, for all your work with Ali and the work that you're doing to advance the careers of people of color and women in higher education administration. We all want to reach our fullest potential, but we want to lift as we climb. And so I agree with Dr. Joseph and so many of his comments around the cyclical nature, because education is power, right? Education is power. So we have seen the power play across the time. Who gets access to education? Who gets opportunity to education? Who controls education? Just think about all of the political platforms that we've seen, from our lowest local government official to the presidency. And education is a platform experience. So the work that we do, as you have in your opening comments, the work is not easy, but the work in terms of racial battle fatigue, especially for us, doing the constant inclusive excellence work, being the voice of reason and the North Star for our presidents. We have to be able to think about the little gems that we get and what gives us hope and keeps us going. And to Dr. Joseph's point, we see all of the progress that that's being made, but we also see the progress on our campus. You know, when a first generation student wins a major award and the entire family is there, right? 2 tables are there to cheer this person on. And that's what keeps us going. The young people that are coming to conferences, sort of following us all around because they want to grow into, you know, diversity leaders. As you mentioned in my bio, I am at the University of Kentucky now, and I'm a builder. So I like to go to places where there's struggle, right? I'm in the state of the bluegrass, of bourbon, of basketball, but of post Breonna Taylor and of Mitch McConnell. So while we don't have any legislation in the Commonwealth right now, we are looking to January that we might be the 32nd state around the dismantling and undoing of DE&I work in higher education, despite the state expecting public education and public higher education to overextend ourselves on metrics for performance-based DEI work. So just think about that sort of juxtaposition of, we may be dismantling this, but we still holding you accountable to do the right thing to advance Kentucky, people of color, folks from Appalachian, and those that are under-resourced. So Dr. Means Coleman, this is complicated work. It's not easy, but we keep going.
Yeah. Dr. Sellers, this is a perfect segue into even the work that you've been doing at the University of Michigan. So Michigan has been at the forefront of this sort of cyclical battle, right, around affirmative action legislation. Texas and Michigan were sort of on the front lines of this. Add to that this other piece that Dr. Alpert has talked about, which is about metrics, measures, accountability. As we are sort of being attacked and torn down, we are still being held accountable. How are you doing, and where is that reward, innovation, progress happening at your campus?
Well, first, I also want to thank you, Robin, for the opportunity to participate on this wonderful panel, and the leaders of Ali, and welcome everybody this morning. So on a personal level, where am I? I'm actually in New Mexico, and I was just in Texas yesterday. Now I'm on a 2-month sojourn around the country as I stepped down from the vice provost, as a way of healing, and also as a way of recognizing something that I think is extremely important in this position, and something that both Peniel and Katrice really harped on, and that is that this has a long history. The struggle has a long history, and that history is not only cyclical, but sometimes we tend to see things as up and down when in fact they're actually always there. The struggle is always there. What becomes more visible at a national level or in a particular space may vary over time, and is remarkable, in whether it's 100-year, 50-year, whatever cycle you want to look, going back through the US. The reality is there's always been struggle, and there will always be struggle, and there has always been resistance, and there will always be resistance. And so where my optimism comes is that the bigger the resistance, in some ways, that's also the bigger the advancement. So I know many of you who are here just came from Nadahi last week. which from my understanding was an amazing conference and gathering of change agents across the country in higher education, doing innovative and exciting things. So while on the one hand, the notion of holding us accountable through metrics or other things are often used as a way to discount and disrupt us, it is also an opportunity for us to actually improve the work that we do, to begin to think about what our progress actually looks like, to articulate the strengths, the things that we have done that have made a difference, while at the same point in time, constantly improve. And we should never, ever be afraid of improvement, while at the same point in time, not give up a narrative and fight back against a narrative that questions our legitimacy, our impact, and our purpose.
Can we continue this a little bit? And Dr. Albert, I see you nodding, so I'm going to start with you, but I wanted to kind of drill down a bit on the bigger the resistance, the bigger the advancement. I think that's really interesting. And we may have seen a different kind of resistance, but big challenges coming out of George Floyd's murder. And then there were corporations, higher ed, nonprofits, everybody was looking for a chief diversity officer. Opening the door perhaps allowed us to do some good work in a number of spaces, but does this feel a little bit different? And what are maybe some of the opportunities for the bigger advancement? Dr. Albert, would you like to start? And then Rob, I'll circle back to you and then pop over sorry, Dr. Sellers, I'll circle back to you and then pop over to Dr. Joseph.
Yeah, so Dr. Coleman, I really appreciate that question of you know, the time lapse, right? The time lapse. We know that there's always been resistance, and Dr. Sellers, I appreciate that comment. The bigger the resistance, the more opportunities that we get to continue to try and make progress. I do agree with you, Robin, that right after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, others, all sectors tried to lean into a DE&I initiative or platform and open the door for more voices to come to their senior leaders table. Does this seem different? I think it might be that we see the cycle happening, because I also feel like some of the sectors are becoming fatigued with the conversation of DE&I. And I think that with the 31 states doing their part legislatively to dismantle what has been done. I know of many of my colleagues who are in other sectors saying, Katrice, can you help me, you know, think through my own career trajectory? Because I don't think that I'm going to be retained much longer. So people are feeling
That's
sort of
different.
the pushback.
Yeah.
Right? The pushback. So, I mean, to our colleagues who are doing this good work, no matter their role, right? Because they wouldn't be on this webinar with us even if they were not chief diversity officers doing the work of inclusive excellence. You've got to affirm and confirm with your leaders that this is real serious and that they will be with you win or draw, not win or lose.
Yes.
Win or draw. They're going to be supportive, and I'm talking about your board of trustees. I'm talking about your president. So I don't know if this seems different. I just think that there is a waning of the impact that those murders had on many sectors outside of higher ed, where my colleagues are saying, I don't think I'm going to be retained. I think I may be non-renewed. I need to start thinking about what the next career move is for me, because they're not serious anymore simply because it's the time gap from, you know, these national experiences.
That's a really good point. The time gap is important. It is a different context. I agree with you. Retained, renewed, or rebranded. In
That's
some
right.
cases, there are offices in the state of Texas that I've heard about where now they're saying, oh, we're going to have to be housed in a different space, called a different thing, or work rebranded. Dr. Sellers, different time, different energy, different space?
Well, I think this is really a consequence of part of the impetus for moving forward. So if your foundation is weak, then when things get rough, you don't have anything to stand on. So if the institution's reasons and justifications for moving towards diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice in a particular way was based on an emotional response to one of or two of many historic killings and unjust killings in this country. It's not surprising that emotion changes very quickly. If our battle is around changing the hearts and minds versus changing the institutions and the behaviors, and doing so in a way that improves the institution, not as a guilt response, but as a response to make the institution better and to live up to what it's supposed to do, then you are susceptible to someone coming around and getting that group that had never felt particularly guilty or whatever, and giving them voice to continue espousing their privilege, and at the same point in time, also given permission to those who acted again out of remorse, but weren't really seeing the change to happen. So it becomes our responsibility to make sure that we push back in such a way that makes it clear that if for instance, in the educational space, if we're not diverse, equitable, and inclusive, then what are we? What is higher education without being diverse, without being equitable, and without being inclusive?
Dr. Joseph, can you get in on this conversation, please?
Oh yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and where we may have opportunities, but this is connected to what you were saying, Dr. Means Coleman, about rebranding as well, is that when we think about the verticals of higher education and we think about DEI, one of the challenges that DEI has faced throughout its existence is it being siloed. So one of the things that we're seeing where we have an opportunity, it's in certain states, it's going to be rebranding unless you get Reconstructionist state legislatures that push back against this anti-DEI. So certain states, just pragmatically, people are going to be forced to rebrand. I want people to understand that. And you have to think of rebranding in this sense, it's not a loss or a capitulation in those specific states. In other states, you're going to be able to call yourself justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. You're going to be good. But in certain states, you're going to have to rebrand. But what we're finding is that you need to actually bake inclusive excellence into every aspect of the university life. And we've really failed to do that. Not Black folks, not people of color, not women and queer folks, but I'm just saying the larger pie, right? So we have to think to ourselves, and I have a couple of strategies. One, when we think about DEI staff across universities, we have to connect DEI staff to faculty in a formal way, both tenure and professional track, so that DEI staff can't just be fired and just laid off. So we have to think of ourselves as all in it together. Some of us here are, tenured professors, and you have an endowed chair, and you're also CDO. But in other places, somebody is this brilliant person, usually a Black woman, who's chief diversity officer, but who's not formally tenured or even part of the professional track. We've got to end all that. We've got to bake it all in, because they're part of the project of higher education and inclusive excellence. So that's one. The other is that we actually have to set up a context where, in addition to a CDO, you have in every single school and department, and this is connected to what Dr. Means Coleman said about rebranding. Whatever we call it, it's somebody who's concerned about inclusive excellence, so that in every single corner of the university, you have somebody who is charged with being concerned about inclusive excellence, collecting that data and making sure that the outcomes are going to be transformed and the outcomes are actually measurable, irrespective of what the Supreme Court decision is going to be. And then three, the final thing is that all of us, Dr. Sellers talked about NADAHE, all of us who are invested in diversity and inclusion, we have to make a better case about diversity and inclusion and equity in the context of research and in the context of social and political and economic impacts. And we have to make that better case at the higher ed level, but also the K through 12 level as well. Because in certain ways, I don't think the case has been made enough beyond the silos of those who are interested in that. And that's not the fault of practitioners. That's just sort of the society and world we live in. We've got to make a case of why inclusive excellence is going to help everybody. Certainly it's going to help people of color, but Dr. Katrice was talking about, in Appalachia, she's in the bluegrass, and she's an institution builder. How's it helping the white kids in Appalachia and the Black kids who might be in Louisville or Bowling Green or whatever, and the Hispanic kids? So we have to do those three things. And again, it may cause for rebranding in certain areas. And this happened during Reconstruction. This is what, during Reconstruction, even in a place like Texas, which on some levels ends its national Reconstruction effort earlier, in Houston, in Tarrant County, the reason why we get Emancipation Park is that we have elected officials. We have elected officials. We have people who sort of, even though there's this backlash, they build a political power base in Houston, and they're able to build Emancipation Park. They're able to go to Republican conventions between 1868 and 1900. They're able to provide a sinecure for Black folks, even though it's a terrible, terrible time in other ways. So we have to be thinking in those strategic ways. And certainly the eyes on the prize piece is really that we have a Reconstructionist federal administration that can impact all these states and turn the narrative towards multiracial democracy, because everything that's being attacked is being attacked because it's supportive of multiracial democracy. And some of our biggest victories are, as we've seen, and we can see on this webinar, so many different Black women and men, but here I'm going to focus on the women, have become such visible higher education leaders that sparks an even bigger backlash, right? Because in the minds of redemptionists, people like Dr. Means Coleman, Dr. Katrice, are not supposed to be not only visible, but really architects of this new multiracial democracy, which is what you all are.
I accept that, Dr. Albert, we accept that, don't we? There's a lot here that I'd like to unpack, and I'd like to start with a question that came in through the chat. And you talked about this Reconstructionist moment and the ways in which legislators work to affect change. And we're talking about connecting past and present. And the question that came through the chat is really about the present, but there may be lessons we can learn from the past. And the question is, what kind of political lobbying is taking place? Or perhaps we can ask the question, did once take place on behalf of our communities, our universities? How can leadership push back? Or is there a danger to those conversations? Do they necessarily need to remain passive to avoid conflict or getting institutions in trouble? How are we talking to our legislature in these times? Anyone?
Yeah, Dr. Means Coleman, I want to just jump in here with the conversation about those of us who are state land grants and those that are dependent on state budgetary allocation, and the fear of our colleagues all across the university, where we have to sort of walk on eggshells with the legislation that in 31 states, right? And are we next? To Dr. Joseph's point, we have to be solution-based with this. So in addition to affirming and confirming that your president and your board of trustees are with you, win or draw, my recommendation is that you create and build a control and command experience with your colleagues all across the university, where your federal and state legislative governmental affairs relations folks and your comms people are helping to be thoughtful about how we interact with our state legislators, who can go into all of these small counties and talk about how do we advance this state. In Kentucky, we are talking about the University of Kentucky advancing Kentucky to be a healthier, wealthier, wiser Kentucky. They've got to see themselves in DEI, right? They've got to see themselves in inclusive excellence.
Dr. Albert, I'm wondering, here at Northwestern, not on all of these points, but on some of them, particularly, which we haven't talked a lot about, the affirmative action case.
Yes.
We've, at Northwestern, and I know a number of universities have treaded very carefully, been a bit muted because you don't want to impact sort of this case that is still open and what you say you perhaps used against you. Dr. Albert, anyone, how do you balance that? We've been here before. How do we have these conversations at the same time? People are coming at us saying, we don't see what you're doing. What are you doing? How are you affecting change? How are you supporting us? How are you balancing that on your campuses?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, we have to be like Misty Copeland, right? We've got to be on our toes all the time. And, we've got to be nuanced in our behaviors. One strategy and solution-based strategy that we have used is that we use some of our strongest alums who are the biggest donors to the university, who have friends that are also politicians, to be able to say on our behalf, this is necessary, this work is vital. How, to Dr. Sellers' point, how can you be a great institution without being diverse, equitable, and inclusive? But it's different when it comes from someone who is one of the most powerful men in the equine business, to be at the state legislature talking about how important it is for DE&I and for equine to have women and people of color be the next generation of this powerful business in our state, right? So that we have the biggest lobbyist, who is an alum of the university, also one of the most powerful people in the bourbon industry talking on our behalf. While we're very busy on the university side, trying to keep the lights on and keep the ball rolling and keep the metrics up, right? To be able to say to people, we continue to do this work day in and day out, despite all of the noise, right? Despite all of the noise. And our young folks that are coming into the industry of professionals as, DE&I, folks who really want a career in doing inclusion in the higher education realm. How do we keep them focused without saying, I don't want any parts of this, I'm about to turn my career in a different direction?
Dr. Sellers, the folks, it is, as Dr. Albert is talking about, it isn't just at the top that we're delivering these messages. Dr. Joseph reminded us about needing diversity leads in every corner of the university. So it can't be one voice. It doesn't, as we know, this work doesn't fall to one person and we can't be successful. I know our universities, and I'm sure a host of others on this call, do have diversity leads. in their respective schools, colleges, and major units. But it's been tough to have those leads in every corner. Some of them are hired into these roles, some are appointed, some volunteer, some it's an add-on to their work. How do you think about the ways in which we can empower those diversity leads to also be sort of our DEI interlocutors? What does that look like?
So I think I love the fact that you use the word empower. That's I think the most important piece. And to also think about this in a way that most of our institutions work. So I would imagine that most of us would say our university is the most decentralized unit in the world. And I would argue the University of Michigan is that way. And that the nature of one's experience looks very different if you're in the School of Nursing versus a student, undergraduate student who happens to be a student athlete versus custodial staff or a dean in one of the universities. And so having people at different aspects of the university is extremely important. And it's extremely important that they have the support centrally to make change at a local level, that they have support in terms of social support, because this is the front lines. This is where they're facing pushback in a way that sometimes those of us who are in central positions don't see quite as naked, may not have the same formal institutional power, but have tremendous opportunities to make difference. And so it's important to first support as part of that empowerment in terms of emotional support in terms of helping to think about direction and movement and doing so in a way that is consistent and coordinated. Provide opportunities for professional development and ultimately professional advancement, recognizing that it's not just simply about them as individuals making differences, but that you're actually creating a system within the university that is not based on any individual, but based on roles, opportunities, and so creating that, what sometimes is a bad word, but is integral to how our institutions work, is a bureaucracy of people who are trained to understand their particular role as well as the big picture role and how what they do fit in it. I liken it to the budget process, the financial process in an institution, and recognizing that anybody who works at the University of Michigan has a fiduciary responsibility to spend university money in a way that is not frivolous. So we all are held accountable in some way. It's not just the responsibility of the chief financial officer. It's the responsibility of each and every person. And each and every unit, for the most part, has somebody who is responsible for the big picture movement within that unit. And they work in coordination with at the school and college level, which ultimately works with the central level. And in the central level, the responsibility is to lay out a long-term plan for institutional development and the use of the institution's financial resources. That's the same way that diversity, equity, and inclusion needs to play out. That it first and foremost must be everybody's responsibility who is part of the institution to promote a more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive environment. Doesn't matter. We're not trying to win your heart and mind. You don't have to believe it. I don't care whether you believe it. It's how you act. I might not believe that I should not be allowed to buy a new TV with the university's money. But if I'm going to be at the University of Michigan, I have to abide by that regardless of where I'm at. So focusing on institutional change over time ends up winning the battle in the sense that it recapitulates itself.
Yes.
It's not based on any one individual or set of individuals who are doing great things, but it's based on recapitulating and redeveloping a set of behaviors, a set of attitudes, a set of shared goals that are the community. And I would argue should be fundamental to, again, the higher education process, because I don't understand what higher education is if it is not diverse, if it is not equitable, and it is not inclusive. And in order to do that, it needs to be at every aspect of the institution.
I have a number of questions and comments that are coming in. If I want to sort of pause just in this moment, first to acknowledge that last point from Dr. Sellers. If higher education is in DEI, I don't know what it is. The very definition of higher education is DEI, because that is about change. And so I wanted to highlight that. I also want to acknowledge that Earl Lewis has entered the room, who is our co-leader along with President McBride. And so I just wanted to say that Earl Lewis has arrived. And now I'd like to shift to a very powerful question that came in. As Peniel mentioned, we are experiencing an era where there have been a number of Black people leading universities, cultural and philanthropic institutions. At the same time, we are experiencing this racial retrenchment on the right, a new labor movement on the left, and a great reckoning of the business model of higher education itself, all simultaneously. How does Black leadership show up in this moment in order to lead meaningful change without being ground up by the competing pressures and movements?
Well, one thing just to follow up on that question, but what Dr. Sellers was saying, I completely agree with him. I think the huge challenge at this point, though, especially in a place like Texas and Florida, perhaps not Michigan at this point, is when a state legislature is proposing laws to say that that's illegal to do. So in terms of within the institution of higher education, because that's what's going on in Texas. I mean, there are things in committee where they want to ban all DEI at the University of Texas, including trying to defund the Division of Diversity Community Engagement, which is the largest such division in any public research university, right? So that forces all of us, if that really is passed, and already it's been passed, a version of it in Florida, to try to be really nimble in terms of you still want the same outcomes or even better outcomes, but what can you do if a state authority over a public research university is saying the way you're interpreting university outcomes is illegal, right? And we're going to defund that. And I think that becomes on us to how do we pivot to get the same outcomes within a context where people are attacking DEI and JEDI initiatives. And I think one of the ways we can do that is to talk about, yes, inclusion, but we have to do it in a way that integrates DEI in longstanding institutional context. So in undergraduate education, the dean of the graduate school, this is where Ally comes into place too, in terms of getting diverse groups of people of color, women, Black folks, into these higher education positions who really care about equity and inclusion. And they may, in certain states like Texas and Florida, have to do it through other means, right? So in certain ways, whereas in one state, a CDO might be the most powerful position you need to get everybody on board. In another state, it might be the dean of the College of Liberal Arts. It might be the dean of, engineering. It might be the dean of the medical school. It might be a different dean or even the provost who's able to do more than the CDO, because these attacks on DEI are making the viability of utilizing that strategy in certain states much less effective than before. And in some states, they're actually going to be defunded. And so it means, how can you still impact first-gen students? How can you still recruit and retain diverse faculty, staff, and students when there really is not going to be a CDO in that state? There's not going to be an associate dean for DEI because they've defunded it and they've mandated that.
I see both Rob and, sorry, Dr. Sellers and Dr. Albert want in. I'm going to just pause for 2 seconds and encourage our audience members to submit your questions and comments. I'll be moving through those. Dr. Sellers.
So I think you're absolutely right in the sense that DEI, so we have to also understand what this is all about. Mm-hmm. So this is a little more than a calculated effort to gin up a particular part of the highly conservative community to push against perceived inequities. And so when you ask them to define what is DEI, they cannot define it. And so if they cannot define what DEI is, then we may have to in some places call it something different and do exactly the same thing. And when calling it something different and doing exactly the same thing leads to the change, then I'm less concerned about the trying to win at the DEI level in terms of this argument, because they don't really care. They don't, most of the politicians in this don't really care one way or the other. Those very same folks who will say, wow, the University of Michigan, very same legislature, the University of Michigan is this bastion of liberalism and it's nothing but communist, da, 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 da. Right after making that speech, will call up and try to get their kids in.
Dr. Sellers, let me ask you a follow-up question on this, though, because it gets back to the question that I read earlier. So is there something interesting about the timing around the sort of wave, an increase in the number of presidents of color, Black presidents we're seeing moving through and doing battle around this DEI climate? It feels like, I know when there was a wave of women who became department chairs, and it was the hardest time, and all of the men retreated, went back to their research, and left us to serve as sort of, pardon the language, but nannies or mammies in some of these departments. It was a dreadful time. Is there something that the legislature or the Board of Trustees knows that we don't? Or is it intentional? What do you think?
So part of this is understanding that the historic power structure doesn't change overnight, even within a generation. You can't have 10 generations of oppression and expect that it's going to change in one generation. So what you start seeing is more and more folks moving forward in terms of leadership. So ALI being an example of this. 20 years ago, you couldn't have had all of the folks of color in a particular space to do that, maybe 40 years ago. And so you're seeing generationally what has happened in terms of the fruits of some of the progress that has been made in the past. Not enough, nowhere near as fast, but that's what's going to happen in terms of the change. And as a function of that, as you move forward, as we move forward as communities in terms of more opportunities, power doesn't just automatically sit back and say, oh, okay, well, we finally lost you. You find new ways to make it more difficult, such that positions that before you thought had more power, all of a sudden begin to have less power and are defined in different ways. And so I think that's just part of the nature of what the struggle actually is. At the same point in time, though, it also provides me with, going back to the very first question, some hope with regards to the future, is that there's opportunity now for more people to be involved and to even have a potential impact than was the case 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And will be even more as we continue to do the kinds of things that we know that are actually working, and hopefully do more of those things, and perhaps do less of the things that aren't working, but not get so defined by what is really a presidential strategy in the Republican Party that has consequences. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it doesn't have consequences, but it is also very poorly put together. So you can't define what DEI is. So the next battle in terms of these various legislative initiatives is, well, how are you actually going to enforce these? It's going to cause us to have to be much more creative, which has always been the case historically in terms of the struggles. Again, the react for every action is a reaction, and we have to react to their reaction. But I don't see it, if we are smart, work hard, any way to completely turn back the progress that we've made.
Come on, Dr. Albert.
Yeah, I mean, so many good points being made by my colleagues, and I just wanted to add on to both points that Dr. Sellers made about, 40 years ago, we would not have had the number of people, being participants in ALI, and I might have won the award this year for nominating, the most colleagues to be able to join in for the next cohort, because we need talented, diverse individuals who want to see their career progression, right, at every part of the institutional enterprise of higher education. So to Dr. Joseph's point, we need people at every corner doing this work, but we really need transformational allies to support those that have been disenfranchised from being our very best selves in all of these academic leadership positions. I say this all the time. We're too good not to be better. We're too good not to be better. And with the turnover of presidents, it's time for us to take our rightful place in leading institutions in these creative ways that we know how to do. But it's also a challenge to each of us to have real support. Bell Hooks says we've got to fall in love with each other over and over and over again. So we've got to use these cohorts and folks on this webinar to be able to be vulnerable and say what's really going on in these roles. And then also to say, you know what, this might not be the place where you can complete your happiness, but let me nominate you for this role that I know where the president and it will be supportive, or the board of trustees is really anxious to have real higher education that builds global leaders. So it's the real support, it's the transformational allyship, and we're too good not to be better.
Dr. Albert, I still feel like we haven't fully hit that powerful question. So as CDOs, we expect the support, sponsorship, mentorship, allyship from our provost and president.
Yes.
And perhaps it's lonely at the top, but there is a churn of presidents. And we as CDOs, there's the ugly truth about the hate mail, the death threats, the protests, the attacks that we get, but we do expect help and support from those that we report up to. The president doesn't quite, university presidents don't quite have that, right? And the board of trustees is it perhaps, variously, they're not always called trustees, but aren't always in that role of support and ally. What does it mean to see the leadership now turn over? These used to be Supreme Court positions, and now we're seeing a churn of 3 to 5 years. And in particular, if we're looking at, say, Temple, it's 2 to 3 years.
Mhm.
So if we need the support from our leadership, how does our leadership get support so that they can in turn help us?
Yeah, I mean, Robin, I think that you are spot on, and the quick churn of presidencies. I've always used the presidents to whom I have served and have worked to say, what keeps you going? How is this job? How can you have longevity in these roles? Because it is not just it's not just a job, it's a lifestyle, right? And so, Dr. McBride is here as a president. And what we know for sure is you've got to be, the president's role is to be in constant contact with her board of trustees every day, trying to make sure that they are staying connected. And I think that that's the expectation of when you're doing these contractual experiences, right? You want to know from that board chair what you expect, because I think when we are sort of chasing after these roles and these top seats, they're looking to hire us, but we also need to be looking to hire them, right? So, is this compatible?
Yes.
Are we?
Yes.
Am I going to be a cultural add such that you're going to be able to support me in those, very lonely times, and those times where we know that it's going to be challenging? And then I would also say that, those conferences, from my intercollegiate world, the conferences, we all have our groups, right? The SEC or the Big 10 or the Big 12 CDOs or chief financial officers. The presidents meet as well, but it also means that you have to be vulnerable enough to have sort of these colleagues that can support you in these very difficult times.
I'd like to turn to if it's okay, to some of the things I see in our Q&A. First, there's a lot of co-signing. I believe this came from Dr. Joseph. Diversity of thought, diverse employees leads to more diverse clients. So Dr. Joseph, you were talking about DEI staff connecting with faculty and the importance of not just having a diverse team, but a diverse team that sticks around. And I think this person is speaking to that. Let's see. Someone else is saying, Dr. Joseph, I so appreciate your comments on partnerships. I am a retired nurse who happens to be white, has a mixed race niece living with us while doing her undergrad at the University of Michigan. I struggle every day about how to make this world better for her as just a private citizen who cares deeply about this topic. So appreciating and co-signing on your comments, Dr. Joseph. Same with Dr. Sellers. I would welcome this is an invitation. I would welcome the opportunity to sit and talk with you over coffee once you return to Ann Arbor, and I won't read the parenthetical because you will be returning to Ann Arbor. Someone who is giving a shout out to Dr. Albert about building the ALI network and doing that work of both sponsorship and mentorship. And then we have a question. Do you expect AI, artificial intelligence, to reinforce racism, misogyny, and xenophobia as it scrapes the web for content? I'll start and say not an expectation. There's a number of us who are media and communication scholars, but we already see that. We see that through facial recognition. There's terrific scholarship out there about that, both in the ways it can or cannot recognize our faces, but also the deployment of that. Shockingly, we saw the NYPD use that kind of facial recognition technology for concert goers who were leaving the Apollo Theater, right? Also recording, it was Madison Square Garden, and then, sort of the NYPD recording people as they were moving in and out of spaces. So behind AI is a human who is defining, dictating, putting that technology to use. And I don't see how AI or other technological means are separate from what we're already doing to each other. Other thoughts on that question?
Well, going back to Dr. Means Coleman, what you were saying about the pressures on the university presidency and what happened to Dr. Wingard at Temple University. Temple University I'm an alum of Temple University, my PhD. I'm a proud owl. I think one of the things, and I think Ally tries to do this, when it comes to the increase in Black university presidents, it becomes really what kind of president are you getting? So you get somebody like Ruth Simmons, President Ruth Simmons, or President Janetta Cole, and now DeRoche and President Claudine Gay, but many others, Jonathan Holloway. And certain kinds of presidents might be a Black president, but is that person somebody who's cognizant and conversant in the humanistic social sciences, as well as maybe being a professor of engineering and economics, right? And can that person really understand the humanistic principles behind higher education? Higher education is supposed to be about freedom and not just emancipation, right? So the person who understands those humanistic, social, scientific principles, you mentioned Dr. Means Coleman, Dr. Bell Hooks, and radically inclusive Black feminist visions of social science and law and philosophy and politics and public policy and health and wellness. That presidency is going to produce certain outcomes. Other Black presidents are being chosen specifically because they are not conversant in these humanistic, social scientific principles and what the value of higher education for humanity is. And when that storm comes, they are not able to articulate what their mission, vision, purpose, values are, right? And so what we need to do is get a series of Black, brown women, folks who are conversant in that, who understand from the bottom of their feet to the top of their head, the deep values that drive all of us into this at our best, right? Because those are the people who, again, I was in Philly. They talk about high crime now. I was in Philly in the early 1990s. And you were getting your chain snatched, your purse snatched. And I'm from Southside Jamaica, Queens, New York, and Philly was popping when it comes to crime, right? And so the only way to withstand that, one, you've got to be on the side of the people. If your graduate students are on strike, you don't threaten their tuition. If you're Black and you're part of the humanistic, even if the board is telling you this, you do what Dr. King says and say, hey, it's going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle, and I'm on their side because they're making less money than me and the board. But the only way you can do that is if you truly believe. And I'm saying this now as a Christian, New Bethel Baptist Church. When you really believe and you have your faith, you're actually going to be on the side of the least of these, even if the board of trustees is against you, right? And so that's what we have. We have to produce those kinds of value-driven administrators. And that's something deep. That's not something that's on your resume. Harvard Business School is not going to give you that. That's the good Lord is going to give you that. Okay, it's not going to that favorite grad school of yours. That's something deeper. And that's what got us here. We talk about Black folks. We always say, and my mom always used to tell me, it was her faith that brought her from Haiti to New York City in 1965. It wasn't degrees. It wasn't any of that stuff. So unless we can produce higher education leaders with that kind of faith in our people, in our community, and building that beloved community, we just become the mainstream in Blackface, right? And that's why Wingard was pushed out. We've got to be on the side of the least of these always, not just when it's opportunistic, like in 2020, right? In 2020, Mitt Romney was in a Black Lives Matter march. I'm telling everybody here, Mitt Romney was at a Black Lives, and they interviewed him and said, what are you doing here? He said, I gotta be here. My father would have been here. My father marched with Dr. King, right? But now it's not popular anymore, right? So those are the value-driven leaders that we need.
We are coming up on the hour. I want to just highlight, I loved this, Dr. Joseph, what you said, that we are not fighting just for emancipation, but for freedom. That's a powerful word. You dropped a lot of powerful words. I want to open this up and give each of you, including President McBride, Dr. Lewis, if you'd like to as well, no pressure, put you on the spot. Your final 2 minutes, a final thought, take 2 minutes to do that. And then I will wrap this up by offering some closing business for our audience. Dr. Sellers, I see you unmuted. Do you have a kind of final 2 minutes or so of message to our audience?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I would hope to leave here with is one, a sense of hope and not despair. And that hope is based on knowing our history and knowing the struggle and knowing the nature of the struggle. Two, that it can't just be hope though. Hope without a plan is just wishful thinking. And so we have to be more, we're called to challenge to this particular moment to address those obstacles that have been put in our way, recognize what is real and what is not, and begin to continue to move forward in building and changing systems, changing institutions, so that it's not just simply individuals that make a difference, but that it is institutions that make a difference, that we begin to make these institutions of higher education actually be what they're supposed to be, to live up to their creeds, whether they're a land grant institution, a public institution, a private institution, whatever the mission is. I guarantee you, if you dig deep enough, you will see where what we now refer to as DEI was called something very different before and continue is fundamental to it. And it's our responsibility to create the kinds of systems that will recapitulate themselves and make that long-term systemic change.
I appreciate that. There's a saying that a member of my team uses, Jasmine Gurno, who is the Director of Native American and Indigenous Affairs. And we talk often about people who have an absence of plans and planning. And she says, those without a plan never know when they are truly lost. And I say that often. So Rob, before I move, or Dr. Sellers, before I move to the others and their final comments, I appreciate that you said, I hope that it isn't just, we weren't sort of just mining the trials, the tribulations that we're going through, but also looking beyond hope to something concrete. Would you leave us with a word about a concrete action or even a way to continue to do this work?
I think it's not only do we have to, and piggybacking on Peniel's point earlier, not only do we have to find people who have the internal moral compass to make the difference, we have to make that moral compass be a part of the job. So you can't be president and not be able to deal with issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion today. That's going to be a major challenge of your presidency, no matter where you are. And how you deal with that is going to determine how successful your work will actually be.
Mhm.
And if you don't have expertise, and that expertise isn't you, and that expertise isn't just in your counsel's office, if you don't have expertise in that space, then you are, as a administrator, set up to fail.
Mm.
And if we don't get our presidents, our provosts, our deans, our department chairs, our board members to understand that, what you end up with, and I think everybody on this panel has gotten those calls of, oh my God, what can we do? Looking for you as a savior when there's a big problem ahead, that chances are we're telling you a long time ago you couldn't do this, but now it's hitting the front and you want the magic chief diversity officer Negro to come in and fix it. We have to make this a part of every administrator's training, expectations, the hiring process. So when you're looking to hire folk, this needs to be the piece of it. It's not about diversity statements or not. That's how they're defining DEI. Whether diversity if they get rid of diversity statements, okay, fine, we'll find some other way. But the question, really, the fundamental question is, can you administer and govern a diverse community in a way that is equitable and inclusive? If you cannot, then you are not qualified to be administrator. Can you teach a diverse student body?
Let me get Dr. Albert in.
Yeah.
Final thoughts, keep it
Yeah.
going.
Yep, Dr. Sellers, thank you so much. And I'm so thrilled to be a part of this panel. So President McBride, Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for having me. I think that when we come into this work, we all had the value system of putting our students first. And so in our waking moments and even in our dreams, we're trying to advance access and opportunity for our students. This work is hopeful work. We have the gems of being able to see our students matriculate to their fullest potential in their undergraduate degrees, professional and graduate degrees, on into their futures. Our work should be connected across the entire university enterprise. We can't do this alone. We get nowhere alone. And so to Dr. Joseph's point earlier, we need our allies, our transformational allies in every corner, but in every role. So as our colleagues who have gone through Ali, those that are in the cohort now, they're building for the future. I heard it once said, to vision yourself into the future is a radical act of hope. And so we've got to vision ourselves into these roles, but then also know that we cannot do this work by ourselves, that networking, that transformational allyship, sponsorship, we've got to do it for others, but hold others, their feet to the fire to do it for us. And so I am just delighted that the light here is all of our colleagues that are on this panel will continue pushing this work despite what the legislatures in these 31 states are doing or saying related to dismantling our work. If we have to rename it, we will keep going. That's what we heard that Harriet Tubman told everybody, right? Just keep going. And we just don't have a choice.
Dr. Joseph, you're going to keep us going 2 minutes and spare me about 40 seconds to just do an announcement. Close us out.
Definitely. I think, hope is a discipline, and I get that from Mariam Kaba, the abolitionist. And I think that we should be higher ed and K through 12 abolitionists. And we think about abolition democracy, where we're not only eradicating systems of punishment, but we're allowing systems of love and wellness to flourish, right? And so for those of us who are in here, I think we should continue to build these networks. We should amplify the ally network. We need to lean on each other. I like what you were saying about either I think Dr. Albert said about falling in love with each other over and over again from bell hooks. And so we need to lean on each other. And again, I think one of the opportunities that Dr. Sellers, he talked about the opportunities this period, and Dr. Albert, is that, you know, those of us who are in the humanistic social sciences, this period of reconstruction leans towards our strengths. So it's really, I know people want the Black economists and they want the Black engineer, and I love those folks. But those of us who are humanistic social sciences broadly, whether we did higher ed or psychology or history or Black studies or sociology or anthropology or political science, this period leans towards our strengths. You know, we can actually learn other parts of the job on the fly that have to do with other parts of university, but trying to deal with the diversity when we think about AI and race and ideas of crime and wellness, this leans towards our strengths. So if anything, all of us who are in this ally network should be really emboldened that in the future, many of us who might not have been considered as university leaders because people were looking for technocrats and managers, these are the exact people who are needed right now. So we should have tremendous amounts of hope in what's to come.
Colleagues, I hope you enjoyed this panel, this webinar as much as I did. This was strategies for continuing to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion while navigating provoking politics in a post-affirmative action world. I know you're on your webinar, but please give a round of applause to Dr. Albert, Dr. Sellers, Dr. Joseph, and our hosts and sponsors, President McBride and Dr. Lewis. I ask you colleagues who are in the audience to be on the lookout for a survey coming into your email inbox. This will support the research of Dr. Alfred Young, who is collecting data on this work. I'm seeing a lot of high praise for the webinar and some thank yous, so I appreciate you. And for our panelists, if you can stick around just for a few minutes after we let the audience go for a debrief from President McBride and Dr. Lewis. Everyone, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a great moderator, Dr. Means Coleman. So brilliant.